The wind howling down from the Montana peaks did not care who had lived or who had died. It only knew how to strip the paint from rotting wood and rattle the loose hinges of a forgotten ranch. 3 days. For 3 agonizing days and nights, Clara Whitfield had not closed her eyes in a proper bed. Since the raw earth had settled over her husband Daniel's grave, she had crouched on the cold floorboards of their decaying home. Her hands were blistered, her lips cracked from the relentless summer heat, and her fingers clutched the cold barrel of a hunting rifle resting across her knees. Beneath her frayed work shirt, a heavy, swelling pregnancy weighed against her ribs, a fragile new life she was fighting tooth and nail to protect in a world that had suddenly turned cruel and empty. She wasn't waiting to be saved. Out here on the frontier, salvation was a luxury for the rich and the lucky, neither of which she was. She was simply fighting to survive. And then, on the 4th morning, a dark bay gelding's hooves broke the heavy silence at her rotting front gate. Ethan Walker pulled his reins on the ridge, his sharp eyes instantly catching what others would have missed. He saw the sagging porch, the broken fence posts, and the unmistakable silhouette of a young, heavily pregnant woman guarding an empty home like a wounded wolf cornered in its den. He knew the land, he knew the danger, and as he stepped down from his saddle and walked toward her broken door with empty hands, he made a silent choice. He wasn't going to look away, and nothing on that mountain would ever be the same again. The Montana sun did not warm the valley, it hammered it. By mid-afternoon, the dust hanging over the wagon tracks outside the town registry office was thick enough to choke a mule, turning the glaring light into a bruised, yellowish haze. Clara Whitfield stood at the edge of that glare, her boots caked in dry alkali, one hand clamped hard against the small of her back, where a dull, persistent ache had settled hours ago. Beneath her faded plaid work shirt, her body felt heavy and strained, the life she was carrying reacting to the raw panic clawing at her throat. Around her, the townspeople of Denor moved with deliberate avoidance. Mrs. Alcott at the dry goods counter had pulled her shades down 5 minutes after Clara walked past. The men loitering near the feed store had stopped talking, their eyes sliding away with a heavy, studied indifference that hurt worse than outright curses. "The registry is closed to you, Mrs. Whitfield," Deputy Pearson had told her not 20 minutes earlier, his thumb hooked in his gun belt as he leaned against the warped pine doorframe. "Mayor Vance says a property under foreclosure and probate dispute ain't a place for tax-paying citizens to linger. You've got till the end of the week to clear out what's left of your husband's iron." She hadn't yelled. She had learned over the last 4 months, since Daniel took his last rattling breath of cold mountain air, that yelling only gave them the satisfaction of calling her hysterical. Instead, she had looked Pearson dead in the eye until the younger man cleared his throat and looked down at his boots. Then she had turned her horse toward the South Trail, away from the town that had swallowed her life, heading deeper into the valley where the river cut through the black granite foothills. Her horse, an old bay mare named Dolly, whose ribs showed too clearly beneath a dusty hide, moved at a sluggish, rhythmic crawl. Every step sent a jolt through Clara's bruised frame. Daniel's death had left her with 240 acres of prime river bottom, a cabin half-rotted by winter damp, and a stack of legal papers bearing a signature that looked chillingly, impossibly wrong. Anne. And now, Mayor Sterling Vance, who owned the bank, the freight line, and half the county council, wanted her land for the new timber route. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged spine of the western ridge, staining the sky the colour of a bruised plum, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of a heavy iron hammer drifted across the dry sagebrush. It was the sound of the river forge. For 2 years, people in the valley spoke of Silas McCray, the way they spoke of the weather or the winter wolves, as a force of nature best left undisturbed. He didn't come to town for Sunday socials. He didn't trade gossip at the general store. He bought his pig iron and charcoal in bulk twice a year, loaded his wagon in absolute silence, and drove back up to his stone shack by the river bend. They called him Iron McCray because of his shoulders and because folks whispered he'd fought in the artillery wars back east before a shell fragment took the smile out of him and left him half deaf to foolish talk. Clara didn't care about town whispers. She needed a cold chisel straightened and a shoe reset on Dolly, and she had exactly 3 nickels left in her coat pocket. She nudged the mare forward, the gravel crunching loudly under hooves as they crested the slope above the river. The forge sat squat and immovable against the grey cliffside, built from thick river stones and heavy cedar timbers blackened by decades of soot. A massive leather bellows wheezed from within, and through the wide-open double doors, a blinding tongue of orange flame leaped toward the timber rafters, turning the surrounding dusk into deep, ink-black shadows. Clara reined Dolly in near the horse rail. She dismounted stiffly, her knees trembling from the long ride and the relentless weight in her belly. She didn't wait to be invited. She walked right up to the threshold of the open double doors, her hand resting instinctively over her stomach, and caught her breath against the thick, sulphurous smell of burning coal and hot metal. Inside, standing before the glowing heart of the forge, was a mountain of a man. Silas McCray wore a scarred leather apron that reached from his thick neck to his heavy work boots, crisscrossed over a sweat-stained grey cotton shirt. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with dense, dark muscle that twitched with every downward stroke of his arm. He didn't look up when she entered. He gripped a pair of long-handled tongs in his left hand, holding a white-hot horseshoe against the iron anvil, while his right hand brought a 12-pound smithing hammer down with rhythmic, earth-shaking precision. Clang! Sparks showered outward like golden rain, dying against the stone floor before they could touch his boots. Clara stood just inside the threshold, watching the massive, unyielding sweep of his shoulders. For all the terror of the town behind her, for all the cold, empty nights she had spent guarding her floorboards with a rifle, the heavy, deliberate ringing of that anvil felt like the only solid thing left in a world gone crooked. Silas brought the hammer down one final time, a soft, echoing ping that signaled the end of the stroke. He dropped the shoe into a wooden barrel of dark, hissing water. A thick plume of white steam roared upward, billowing toward the high rafters and temporarily hiding his face in a dense, swirling cloud. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood motionless, his massive forearms resting on the edge of the anvil block, his heavy head bowed, as if listening to something only he could hear in the cooling water. "If you've come for harness buckles," Silas said, his voice coming from deep within his chest, a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate straight up through the floorboards. "The iron's cast. Come back Friday." Clara didn't flinch. She gripped the leather-bound measurement notebook tighter against her ribs, squared her tired shoulders, and let her voice cut cleanly through the lingering steam. "I didn't come for buckles, Mr. McCray," she said, her voice steady despite the dry rasp in her throat. "I came because my horse throws a shoe on the North Trail, and because I reckon you're the only man in this county who doesn't take orders from Mayor Sterling Vance." Silas McCray slowly turned around. The steam cleared, revealing a face carved from granite and stubborn years. His jaw was heavy, shadowed by a thick, iron-grey beard, and his nose bore the flat, crooked bridge of an old break that had healed on its own terms. But it was his eyes that stopped Clara in her tracks, a deep, stormy grey, entirely devoid of the nervous curiosity or cruel judgment she had grown used to seeing in Du Nord. They were the eyes of a man who looked at raw steel and saw only what it could become under pressure. He didn't look at her face first. With the instinct of a man who spent his life reading survival, his gaze dropped instantly, sweeping past her worn boots, taking in the tired sag of her shoulders, and lingering for a hard, unblinking heartbeat on the swell beneath her plaid work shirt. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady drip, drip, drip of water falling from the quenching barrel onto the stone floor. "You're Clara Whitfield," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the forge, refusing to echo against the stone walls. "Daniel's woman from upriver. The one the town council's been howling about like wolves over a fresh carcass." "Was Daniel's woman," Clara corrected sharply, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch as she met his steady stoop. "Tear. Now I'm just the woman standing in your doorway, with an old mare that needs a shoe and 3 nickels in her pocket. If that's not enough to buy your time, Mr. McCray, just say so, and I'll take my horse down to the riverbank."
Hello there, friend.
She turned half an inch toward the door, her muscles protesting the sudden shift in weight, but pride kept her from flinching. She had survived 4 months of solitary terror, cold floors, and predatory land agents. She would not beg a blacksmith for charity.
Friend.
"Hold on," Silas grunted. The sound was like a boulder shifting on a hillside.
Now.
He didn't make a grand gesture or offer a softening smile. Instead, he reached out with his massive, soot-blackened hand, picked up a pair of iron tongs, and thrust them back into the glowing coals of the hearth.
Keep your
With his other hand, he grabbed the heavy hand pump lever beside the forge and pulled it down twice. A fresh breath of air rushed through the charcoal, and the orange flames roared back to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the rugged timber walls. "Bring the mare inside," Silas said, turning his back to her as he began working the bellows with steady, measured strokes. "The flies are biting down by the creek, and a pregnant woman standing in the dust is bad for the iron." The bluntness of it caught Clara off guard. There was no pity in his voice, none of the sticky, condescending sympathy Mrs. Alcott dispensed behind her counter like spoiled molasses. It was purely matter-of-fact, like a man telling you the rain was coming. Without another word, Clara stepped back out into the blistering glare, untied Dolly, and led the weary animal into the vast, cool gloom of the stone forge. The transition from the scorching sun to the shadowy interior felt like stepping into a different world. The air here smelled of old iron, cedar smoke, and clean river water. Silas didn't watch her struggle, but he didn't rush to take the reins either. When Dolly shifted nervously at the smell of the sulphur, Silas simply extended a broad, calloused palm toward the mare's nose, murmuring a single, low sound deep in his throat. The horse quieted instantly, lowering its head as if recognizing a kindred spirit who understood the weight of heavy burdens. "Hold her lead rope right there," Silas instructed, pointing with his chin toward a heavy iron ring bolted into the stone pillar near the anvil. "Lift her left foreleg when I tell you. Don't let her lean her weight on me. She's got too much bulk on those front quarters for a tired shoulder." Clara did as she was told. She gripped the lead rope, her fingers brushing against the coarse hemp, and planted her boots firmly on the packed earth floor. Silas knelt beside the mare, with surprising agility for a man of his size. His scarred leather apron rustled against the dirt as he lifted Dolly's hoof, wedging it securely between his knees. Whir. King with practiced, ruthless efficiency, he pulled the old, worn nails from the iron shoe one by one, tossing them into a scrap metal tin with a sharp clink. His hands were massive, yet they moved with the delicate precision of a watchmaker. Every motion was clean, economical, and devoid of wasted energy. "The town's saying you've got 60 days before they toss your things into the sagebrush," Silas muttered, not looking up as he scraped a rasp across the mare's hoof wall, sending a fine grey shower of horn curling down into the dust. "Saying Daniel signed a loan with the Peelan Company before the winter fever took him." "They're lying," Clara said, her voice dropping into a harsh, bitter register. "Daniel never borrowed a dime from Peeland. We paid off the original homestead deed 3 years ago. I have the receipt in my trunk, signed and sealed by the county clerk, before he mysteriously transferred out of the district." Silas paused. The rasp stopped moving against the hoof. He held Dolly's leg steady in his lap for 3 long seconds, his massive shoulders perfectly still under the heavy cotton shirt. "A forged signature is hard to beat when the judge plays poker with the man who bought the paper," Silas said quietly. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say it was going to be all right. He simply stated the brutal, unvarnished truth of the frontier. He dropped the old shoe into the dust, picked up a fresh, glowing iron bar from the coals, and placed it on the anvil. Clang, clang. The hammer fell, shaping the red-hot metal with stunning accuracy. Every stroke seemed to beat back the rising tide of fear that had been threatening to drown Clara since dawn. When he finished shaping and cooling the shoe, he nailed it securely into place, checked the fit with a critical eye, and lowered Dolly's leg. Only then did he stand up, wiping his brow with the back of a soot-darkened forearm, leaving a dark smudge across his forehead. He walked over to a small wooden wash basin in the corner, rinsed his hands in cold water, and picked up a dry burlap towel. Then, surprising her entirely, he walked past her toward a small, ladder-like stairway built into the rear stone wall. A stairway leading up to the low-ceilinged loft beneath the timber rafters. "The loft's dry," Silas said over his shoulder, his deep voice echoing off the stone. "There's a cot up there with a wool blanket that hasn't seen a moth in 5 years. And there's half a pot of bean soup and some hard bread on the stove." Clara stood frozen by the anvil, her fingers still clutching Dolly's lead rope. "Mr. McCray, I didn't come here looking for a place to sleep. I came to pay for a horseshoe." Silas stopped at the foot of the ladder. He turned his head slightly, his stormy grey eyes fixing on her with an unyielding intensity that made her breath catch. "You brought a tired horse, 3 nickels, and a face of a woman who hasn't slept a full night since the ground froze over," Silas said flatly. "The shoe costs 2 nickels. That leaves you 1 nickel, which isn't enough to buy a cup of coffee in Denor, let alone a safe roof for a child who's fixing to arrive before the corn is harvested." He pointed a thick, calloused finger upward toward the dark shadow of the loft. "The loft is dry," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And my name is Silas. Get your horse settled and get up those stairs before the mountain air turns sour." Without waiting for her answer, Silas turned and climbed up into the shadows of the loft, leaving Clara standing alone beside the glowing embers of the forge, the steady ringing of the anvil still echoing softly in her chest. The loft above the forge was small, smelling faintly of dried sage, old cedar timber, and the clean, bitter scent of iron filings. It wasn't much of a home, just a narrow cot with a lumpy straw mattress, a low wooden table holding a chipped ceramic pitcher of water, and a small round window that looked out over the rushing dark water of the river. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, her boots off, rubbing her aching calves. Downstairs, the heavy, muffled sounds of Silas moving about the forge grounded her. She heard the scrape of the cast-iron skillet against the stovetop, the dull thud of wood being stacked into the box, and the occasional hiss of water as he cleaned up for the night. He hadn't asked her where she came from, nor had he offered any hollow promises about fighting the county court for her. He had simply given her a roof, half a pot of bean soup, and a locked door against a world that wanted her broken. By the time the third day broke over the razor-sharp edge of the eastern peaks, painting the sky in strokes of bruised gold and slate, Clara had found her rhythm within the stone walls. She wasn't the kind of woman to sit idle while a man worked.
While Silas was out checking his timber lines up the ridge, she swept the forge floor, organised the boxes of horseshoe nails by size, and used a damp rag to clean the soot off the iron-mounted ledger shelf. Her fingers brushed against the leather-bound measurement notebook in her coat pocket, the record of every fence post, irrigation ditch, and seed bag Daniel had bought since they laid claim to the ranch. She was deep into cross-referencing the forged debt dates with Daniel's actual handwriting entries when the heavy timber doors of the forge swung inward with a violent crash. Clara froze, her hand tightening around the notebook. 2 men stood in the bright morning sunlight flooding the threshold. They weren't local farmers or honest tradesmen. They wore tailored wool waistcoats under dust-caked riding coats, their boots polished to a high sheen that looked entirely out of place in the ridge. Mud. The man in front had thin, slicked-back dark hair, a narrow moustache waxed to sharp points, and eyes as cold and flat as newly minted dimes. "Mrs. Whitfield," the man drawled, his voice carrying an oily, practiced charm that failed to reach his eyes. "I'm Carter Hobbs, legal counsel for the Peeland Land and Commerce Company. And this is Mr. Vane's associate, though I doubt you need introductions to the men managing your late husband's financial obligations." Clara stood up slowly from the wooden stool near the anvil, her fingers slipping into the deep pocket of her plaid shirt where she kept her small, bone-handled pocket knife. She didn't speak. She just watched them, with the cold, unblinking focus of a trapped animal that had decided it was done running. Carter Hobbs stepped further into the cool gloom of the forge, wrinkling his nose slightly at the smell of coal smoke. He pulled a folded parchment from his breast pocket and snapped it open with a sharp rustle. "We have reason to believe you are attempting to conceal property and legal documents pertaining to the Whitfield tract," Hobbs continued, his tone hardening as he stepped toward the inner work area. "Mayor Vance has authorized us to inspect any personal effects brought off the ranch premises. Hand over the ledger, Mrs. Whitfield. Save yourself the trouble of a circuit court contempt charge." "You have no jurisdiction here," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and steady against the stone walls. "This is Silas McCray's property. Step 1 foot closer to this anvil, Mr. Hobbs, and you'll find out what an iron-weighted hammer feels like when it's thrown by a woman who has nothing left to lose." Hobbs smirked, a tight, unpleasant stretching of his thin lips. "A spirited widow. How tragic. But Mr. McCray is out on the ridge, and you—" He didn't finish the sentence. From the dark shadows of the rear storage alcove, a massive, immovable figure detached itself from the gloom. Silas stepped out into the light, like a grizzly bear rising from a winter den. He wasn't holding a hammer, but his bare forearms were crossed over his broad chest, his knuckles scarred and thick, and his stormy grey eyes locked onto Carter Hobbs with a suffocating, lethal stillness. The temperature in the forge seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Hobbs," Silas said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that shook the dust off the rafters. "You're tracking mud across my clean floor." Carter Hobbs froze. The associate behind him actually took a half-step backward, his hand hovering uselessly over a holstered revolver he clearly lacked the nerve to draw. Silas McCray didn't raise his voice, didn't brandish a weapon, but the sheer gravity of his presence sucked the oxygen right out of the room. He was an immovable mountain of muscle and soot, and the stormy grey of his eyes promised absolute violence if his warning was ignored.
"Mr. McCray," Hobbs stammered, the oily confidence slipping from his face like cheap paint in the rain. "This is official county business. Mayor Vance doesn't own the stone you're standing on," Silas interrupted. He took one slow, deliberate step forward. The scarred leather apron creaked, a heavy, ominous sound in the quiet forge. "This is a private boundary, and if you ever threaten a guest under my roof again, Hobbs, you'll be leaving Denor with a broken jaw. Now turn around and walk back out into the dust." Hobbs opened his mouth, caught the look in Silas's eyes, and wisely snapped his jaw shut. Without another word, he spun on his polished heel and marched out of the double doors, his silent associate trailing closely behind. The sound of their horses galloping away down the river trail faded into the steady rushing of the water. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand slipping away from the bone-handled knife in her pocket. She looked at Silas. He hadn't gone up the ridge at all. He had been in the shadows the entire time, standing quiet guard while she worked. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of what he had just done. By turning away the mayor's men, he had painted a target on his own massive back. Silas didn't acknowledge the thanks. He simply walked over to the anvil, picked up his heavy iron hammer, and checked the cooling metal of the hearth. "A dog only bites when it thinks you're alone, Clara. They know you aren't alone anymore. But Vance won't let a public embarrassment lie. He'll escalate." That night the forge was silent, save for the low, comforting crackle of the banked coals. Up in the timber loft the air was warm, smelling of wood smoke and the rich, earthy scent of the roasted venison Silas had brought up on a tin plate.
A single kerosene lantern cast a circle of amber light over the small wooden table. Clara sat on one side, her faded plaid shirt unbuttoned at the collar against the heat, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Across from her sat Silas. He had taken off his leather apron, his broad shoulders filling the cramped space of the loft, looking completely out of place at the delicate wooden table, and yet perfectly at home in the quiet dark. Between them lay the leather-bound measurement notebook and the folded foreclosure writ Hobbs had tried to enforce in town 3 days ago. "Show me," Silas said quietly. Clara opened the notebook. She turned to a page filled with neat, meticulous handwriting, lists of timber costs, seed grain, and horseshoe nails. Then she unfolded the county writ, pushing both into the circle of lantern light. "Daniel was a careful man," Clara said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "He didn't trust banks, and he didn't trust verbal agreements. He read every word before he put his pen to paper. Look at the way he writes his capital D." Silas leaned forward, his stormy eyes scanning the page. "The loop on the left," Clara pointed with a slightly trembling finger. "It never closes. Not in 9 years of writing it. And look at the way he crossed his T. Always sharp, always slanted slightly upward." She moved her finger to the foreclosure document. "Now look at the signature on this debt paper. It's close. Whoever forged it studied his hand. But the loop on the D is closed tight, and the T is crossed flat. It's a forgery, Silas. Daniel didn't sign away our land. Vance had someone fabricate this after Daniel died, knowing I wouldn't have the money or the backing to fight it in a circuit court." Silas stared at the 2 documents for a long, silent minute. The shadows danced across his rugged, square face. He reached out with a thick, calloused finger. But he didn't point at the signature. He pointed at the red wax seal and the notary stamp at the bottom of the forged page. Elias Thorne, Silas murmured, the name sounding like a curse in his deep register. The county clerk, Clara confirmed. He stamped the original clear deed for our ranch 3 years ago. But when I went to the registry to pull the copy, Pearson told me Thorne had abruptly moved to Nevada. The copy was gone, replaced by this. It's not just your ranch, Clara, Silas said, looking up, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden, piercing intensity. A month ago, Old Man Henderson lost his timber claim on the North Ridge. A week before that, the Miller family was evicted from the lower valley. Both times, Vance claimed they defaulted on sudden, unpayable debts. Both times, Thorne was the clerk of record. The sheer scale of it settled over the small loft like a heavy blanket.
It wasn't just a greedy land grab. It was a systematic, calculated eradication of independent homesteaders to pave the way for Vance's timber monopoly. And Clara, isolated, pregnant and grieving, was simply the latest obstacle they thought they could sweep away. I need to get this to the federal magistrate in Helena, Clara said, her voice tight but refusing to break. If I can get a circuit judge to look at the handwriting comparison and subpoena Thorne's ledger before Vance destroys it, I can save my home. But if Vance knows I have Daniel's original notebook, he'll burn it, Silas finished for her. And he'll burn whoever is holding it. Clara looked at the massive man sitting across from her. He had already given her shelter, fed her, and stood between her and the mayor's men. She had no right to ask him for more. She reached for the notebook, intending to pull it back, to spare him the danger that was inevitably coming. Before she could pull the leather-bound book away, Silas's hand moved. His large, soot-stained fingers closed gently over hers, stopping her movement. His skin was rough, calloused from years of striking hot iron, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, a careful restraint born of immense strength. You aren't riding to Helena alone, Silas said. Silas, you don't owe me this fight, Clara whispered, her hazel eyes searching his face, looking for the catch, the hidden cost that every man in the frontier eventually demanded. I fought in a war over lines on a map, Clara, Silas replied, his voice dropping into a low, steady cadence. I watched good men die for politicians who wouldn't know the smell of gunpowder if it burned their own coats. When I came to this valley, I swore I was done fighting other men's battles. I swore I'd just work the iron and let the world rot. He slowly released her hand, tapping his heavy finger against the forged document. But this ain't a war. This is a slaughter, and I don't abide the slaughter of women and children. His jaw set, turning to unyielding granite. Vance knows you didn't surrender today. He knows you're under my roof. By tomorrow morning, he won't send 2 men with legal papers. He'll send 12 men with torches and rifles. Clara felt a cold knot of dread pull tight in her stomach, her hand instinctively pressing against her swollen belly. What do we do? Silas stood up, his broad shoulders brushing the low timber rafters of the loft. He looked down at her, the stormy grey of his eyes burning with a quiet, terrifying resolve. We do what a blacksmith does, Clara, he said softly. We lock the gates, we stoke the fire, and we let them break themselves against the iron. The valley did not cool when the sun went down. The heat simply thickened, settling heavily into the dry sage and the dust. Inside the forge, the darkness was absolute, save for the dull, angry red glow of the banked coals in the hearth. Clara sat on the edge of the cot in the loft, her boots laced tight, the leather-bound notebook tucked securely inside her work shirt against her ribs.
She was exhausted, her body aching with the heavy, pulling weight of her pregnancy, but sleep was impossible. Her hazel eyes were fixed on the small, round window that looked out toward the wagon trail. Below her, the forge was silent, but it was a heavy, coiled silence. Silas had spent the last 2 hours preparing the ground. He had brought Dolly and his own draft horse into the reinforced stone alcove at the back of the building. He had dropped heavy iron crossbars, forged from thick wagon axles, across the inside of the double timber doors. He had not lit a single lantern. He moved through the pitch-black space by memory, a massive, silent shadow organizing his space for war. They won't come quietly. They never got the chance to throw them. With a sound like a cannon shot, Silas kicked the iron latch holding the crossbars. He didn't just open the double doors, he threw them outward with such explosive, terrifying force that the heavy timbers slammed back against the stone walls, shattering the hinges. The sudden rush of oxygen fed the banked coals behind him. The hearth flared, silhouetting Silas in a halo of burning, blood-red light. He stood in the threshold, an immovable mountain of iron-corded muscle, the 12-pound hammer gripped easily in his right hand. To the men outside, he didn't look like a blacksmith. He looked like the devil himself stepping out of a furnace. The 2 men advancing with torches hauled hard on their reins, their horses panicking at the sudden burst of light and the towering figure in the doorway. Silas didn't wait for them to recover. He moved with a speed that defied his massive bulk. He stepped off the threshold, closed the distance in 2 massive strides, and swung the hammer. He didn't aim for the riders. He swung the flat iron head directly into the chest of the nearest horse. He pulled the blow just enough to avoid killing the animal, but the concussive force knocked the wind out of the beast. The horse screamed, buckling sideways and throwing its rider violently into the dirt. The man's torch tumbled into the mud, hissing out in a plume of oily smoke. "God almighty!" someone shouted from the back of the pack. Guns began to clear their holsters, the metallic clack-clack of hammers pulling back, echoing in the yard. "First man who points a barrel at this forge gets his chest caved in," Silas roared. The sound was deafening, a battlefield command that rattled the teeth in Clara's skull, even up in the loft. A heavy-set thug on the left ignored the warning, levelling a repeating rifle at Silas's chest. Silas didn't flinch. He reached down, grabbed the collar of the fallen man, shivering in the dirt at his feet, and hurled him upward like a rag doll, directly into the line of fire. The thug with the rifle panicked, jerking his barrel up and firing wildly into the night sky to avoid hitting his own man. Before the shooter could cycle the lever, Silas was there. His left hand clamped over the hot barrel of the rifle, bending it downward with a sickening screech of torqued metal. His right hand, still holding the 12-pound hammer, came up in a short, brutal arc, the wooden handle catching the man squarely under the jaw. The sickening crack of bone was audible over the roaring river. The man flipped backward out of his saddle, hitting the dust like a sack of wet grain, completely unconscious. Panic rippled through the remaining riders. They had come to intimidate a widow and a solitary tradesman. They had not signed up to fight a siege-hardened artillery veteran who fought like a wounded grizzly. Deputy Pearson's horse was spinning in terrified circles. "Shoot him! Bring him down!" Pearson screamed, but his own hand was shaking so badly he couldn't clear his revolver from his duster. One rider, desperate and foolish, spurred his horse straight at the open doors of the forge, hoping to bypass Silas entirely. He vaulted off his saddle, hitting the dirt floor inside the stone walls, his eyes darting wildly until he saw the ladder leading to the loft. He scrambled toward it, a heavy hunting knife drawn. Clara didn't scream. She didn't retreat into the corner. She stood at the top of the ladder, her boots planted firmly, and as the man reached the third rung, She brought the heavy, chipped ceramic water pitcher down with all her strength directly onto the bridge of his nose. The pitcher shattered into jagged shards. The man howled, blood blinding him instantly, and lost his grip. He fell backward, hitting the hard-packed earth just as Silas stepped back into the forge. Silas didn't even slip. Ow, down. As the blinded man tried to push himself up, Silas planted his heavy, iron-shod boot squarely in the center of the man's chest, pinning him to the floor with bone-crushing pressure. Silas looked out through the open doors at Pearson and the 6 remaining men, who were now actively backing their horses away, their weapons lowered, their eyes wide with raw terror. The yard was littered with 3 unconscious men and a half-dead fire. "Take your garbage out of my yard, Pearson," Silas said, his voice dropping back to that terrifying, low rumble. He pressed his boot down slightly harder, and the man beneath him let out a breathless, desperate wheeze. "And tell Mayor Vance to keep his desk clean. I'm coming for it tomorrow." Pearson didn't say a word. He violently spurred his horse, turning tail and galloping back up the trail toward Denor. The rest of the thugs scrambled to drag their unconscious companions across their saddles, their bravado completely shattered. Within 2 minutes, the yard was empty, leaving only the smell of kerosene and blood in the dry night air. Silas stood in the threshold, watching the darkness until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely. Slowly, the adrenaline drained from his massive shoulders. He leaned the hammer against the stone wall, his chest heaving slightly. Clara climbed down the ladder, her legs shaking so violently she nearly missed the last rung. She moved into the red glow of the hearth, stepping carefully around the shattered pieces of the ceramic pitcher. Silas turned his head. There was a shallow, bleeding gash along his left forearm, where a stray piece of metal or a wild knife swing had caught him, but he didn't seem to notice it. His stormy grey eyes searched Clara's face, looking for the panic, looking for the inevitable fear of the monster he had just had to become to keep her safe. She didn't look at him with fear. She walked straight up to him, pulled the clean, folded bandana from her back pocket, and reached out to press it firmly against the bleeding cut on his arm. "You hit him with the water pitcher," Silas noted, a faint, deeply buried trace of astonishment in his gruff voice. "I told you, Silas," Clara said, her hazel eyes looking up at him, fiercely bright and entirely unbroken. "I'm not surrendering my home." Silas looked down at the small, calloused hands pressing the cloth against his arm. Slowly, his massive hand came up, resting lightly over hers. "Get some sleep, Clara," Silas said quietly, the violence entirely gone from his eyes, leaving only the steady, unyielding warmth of a banked fire. "Tomorrow, we take the hammer to town." Dawn broke over the Montana Valley, not with warmth, but with a harsh, unblinking clarity. The bruised purple sky of the night before gave way to a pale, cloudless blue that offered no place for secrets to hide. Inside the forge yard, Silas McCray moved with the steady, unstoppable momentum of a river cutting through stone. He did not bother saddling Dolly. The mare was too tired, and Clara was in no condition to ride bareback after the adrenaline of the night. Instead, he harnessed his massive Belgian draft horse to a heavy-timbered flatbed wagon. He threw a thick woolen blanket over the wooden bench seat for Clara, his movements economical and devoid of any lingering agitation from the violence of the midnight raid. Clara climbed into the wagon, her hands pressing into the small of her back as she settled onto the wool. Inside her plaid shirt, the leather-bound notebook rested heavy against her ribs, warm from her own body heat. She watched Silas as he did a final check of the leather traces. He wore a clean white cotton shirt tucked into his dark trousers, though the sleeves were rolled up to expose the thick, scarred muscle of his forearms.
He didn't wear a gun belt. He didn't carry a rifle. Instead, he reached into the bed of the wagon and deliberately set his 12-pound iron smithing hammer on the floorboards right beside his boot. "You ready?" Silas asked, his stormy grey eyes looking up at her from beneath the brim of a weathered Stetson. "I've been ready since the day they buried Daniel," Clara said quietly. Silas gave a single, short "mm." He climbed onto the bench beside her, his massive frame taking up more than half the seat, but he was careful to leave a cushion of space between them so as not to crowd her. He clicked his tongue, flicked the heavy leather reins, and the wagon lurched forward, its iron-rimmed wheels crunching loudly against the gravel as they headed up the trail toward Dunor. The ride took just under an hour. Clara watched the familiar landscape roll by, the sparse patches of dry sage, the jagged black rocks jutting out of the alkaline soil, the twisting snake of the river that had carved this valley out of nothing. She felt the child kick again, a strong, rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo the steady clatter of the draft horse's hooves. She placed her hand over her belly, no longer trying to hide her pregnancy, no longer feeling the crushing weight of vulnerability. Beside her sat a man who had fought a dozen armed riders with a hammer and his bare hands, just to ensure she lived to see this sunrise. When the wagon crossed the wooden bridge at the edge of Dunor, the town was already awake and bustling. But as the heavy Belgian draft horse plodded down the centre of the main street, a profound, suffocating silence swept over the boardwalks. Men carrying sacks of flour stopped dead in their tracks. Women sweeping dust from their porches froze, their brooms hovering in the air. They all knew what was supposed to have happened last night. Deputy Pearson's men had ridden out to enforce the eviction. Clara Whitfield was supposed to be gone, run out of the county, or broken into submissi.
None. Instead, she was sitting upright on the wagon bench, her hazel eyes fixed straight ahead, her chin held high, radiating a fierce, untouchable dignity. And driving the wagon, looking like an avenging angel carved from granite and iron, was Silas McCray. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt directly in front of the town council building, a 2-story structure of whitewashed pine that housed the registry, the sheriff's office, and Mayor Vance's private chambers. He wrapped the reins around the brake lever, stood up and stepped down into the dust. He reached up, offering his large, calloused hand to Clara. She took it, letting his immense strength steady her as she climbed down the high step. Silas reached back into the wagon and picked up the 12-pound hammer. He didn't sling it over his shoulder aggressively. He carried it loose and low by his side, its sheer weight pulling his arm straight. But the message was unmistakable. They walked up the wooden steps together. The crowd that had gathered on the street parted like water, no one daring to breathe too loudly, let alone speak. Inside the council chambers, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the low hum of self-important conversation. Mayor Sterling Vance sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, flanked by 3 council members and Carter Hobbs, the oily lawyer from the Peeland Company. Deputy Pearson was standing near the back window. Dow. The right side of his face was swollen and purple, and he held his left arm stiffly against his ribs. Vance was a man who hid his cruelty behind expensive wool suits and a carefully trimmed silver beard. He was in the middle of signing a stack of land transfer documents when the heavy double doors of the chamber swung open with a loud, resounding thud. The room went dead silent. Silas walked in first, his broad shoulders easily clearing the doorway, his heavy boots echoing like drum beats against the hardwood floor. Clara walked half a step behind him, her hand resting over her belly, her eyes locked dead onto Sterling Vance. Vance's pen froze on the paper. For a fraction of a second, the polished mask slipped, revealing the raw, calculating panic of a man who realized his hunting dogs had been gutted by the bear. He glanced sharply at Pearson, who immediately looked away, staring at the floorboards in absolute terror. "McCray," Vance said, recovering his voice and trying to inject it with mayoral authority. "This is a closed session of the town council. You have no business here. And Mrs. Whitfield is in violation of a county foreclosure writ." "The writ is a lie," Clara said. She didn't wait for Silas to speak for her. She stepped out from behind the blacksmith's protective shadow, walking straight up to the edge of the polished mahogany table. She unbuttoned the top button of her plaid shirt, reached in, and pulled out the leather-bound measurement notebook. She dropped it onto the table with a heavy smack that made Carter Hobbs flinch. "My husband, Daniel, recorded every inch of wire, every pound of seed, and every nail bought for our ranch in that ledger," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and hard off the wood-panelled walls. "He signed his name at the bottom of every monthly tally. Open it." Vance didn't move. He sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes darting toward the heavy iron hammer, resting casually against Silas's right leg. Clara reached over, grabbed the forged Peeland debt document resting near Vance's inkwell, and slammed it down right next to the open notebook. "Look at the capital D," Clara commanded, pointing a fierce, trembling finger at the pages. "My husband never closed the loop on his D, not once in 9 years. And he crossed his T on an upward slant. The signature on this debt paper is a forgery, manufactured by someone who studied his hand but didn't know his habits." "Handwriting analysis is subjective," Carter Hobbs sneered, trying to rally his legal defences, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant bite. "It proves nothing in a court of law. The document bears the official county seal and the signature of Clerk Elias Thorne. It is illegally binding. Elias Thorne is a corrupt coward who fled this county because he knew this was a federal crime," Silas interrupted. His voice was a low rumble that instantly silenced the lawyer. Silas took one step forward. The floorboards groaned in protest under his weight. He lifted the 12-pound hammer and set it down precisely on top of the forged document, pinning the fake signature to the polished mahogany desk. The heavy iron head left a deep, permanent dent in the expensive wood. "I've got 3 men waking up with concussions in my forge yard, Vance," Silas said quietly. He leaned forward, bracing his massive, scarred hands on the edge of the table, bringing his face level with the mayor's. "They came with torches in the middle of the night to burn a pregnant widow out of her home. They said you sent them. Now, you can either sit in that chair and explain to a federal magistrate in Helena how a dead man signed a loan with a closed loop on his D, or you can try to throw me out of this room." The silence in the chamber was absolute. The other council members were staring at the documents, then at Pearson's bruised face, then at the dent the hammer had left in the desk. The sheer, undeniable physical reality of the fraud was laid bare, anchored by the unyielding presence of a man who could not be bought, bullied, or burned out. Vance looked at the hammer, then at the stormy grey eyes of the blacksmith. The mayor's face drained of colour, turning the sickly pale shade of old parchment. He knew it was over. If this went to a federal circuit judge with a handwriting expert, the whole syndicate would unravel. "Withdraw the claim, Hobbs," Vance whispered, his voice cracking, the polished facade completely shattered. "Mayor, you can't be serious. We have—" "I said withdraw the damn claim!" Vance shouted, his hands shaking as he pushed his chair back from the desk, desperate to put distance between himself and Silas McCray. The company made an administrative error. The Whitfield estate is clear." Clara stood at the table, her chest heaving as she pulled oxygen into her lungs. She looked at the forged paper pinned under the iron hammer, then at the trembling mayor. She reached out, pulled her husband's leather-bound notebook back, and tucked it safely against her chest. It wasn't an error, Mayor Vance, Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, icy register that carried all the weight of her survival. It was a crime. And I will be sending this evidence to the federal prosecutor in Helena this afternoon. You're done stealing from this valley. She turned her back on the most powerful men in the county. She didn't look back to see their reactions. She walked toward the heavy double doors, her head held high, the suffocating fear that had shadowed her for 4 months, finally burning away in the morning light. Silas picked up his hammer from the desk. He looked at Vance one last time, a look of profound, withering disgust, before turning and following Clara out the door. The ride back to the river valley felt entirely different from the agonizing journey Clara had made 3 days prior. The Montana sun was just as unforgiving, the dust just as thick, but the crushing, suffocating weight that oppressed against her ribs for 4 months was gone. Before leaving Denor, Clara had stopped at the telegraph office. The operator, a nervous young man who had witnessed the confrontation in the council chambers, sent her wire to the federal magistrate in Helena without asking for payment up front. The physical ledger and the forged documents were securely wrapped in oilcloth, entrusted to a stagecoach driver heading directly to the territorial capital, a man who owed Silas McCray his life from a blizzard 2 winters past, and who would die before letting Vance's men intercept his cargo. Mayor Sterling Vance's empire of paper and intimidation was already beginning to crumble. By nightfall, the federal marshals would be mounting up. In the wagon, Clara sat beside Silas in companionable silence. The heavy Belgian draft horse plodded steadily along the river trail. Clara looked at the man beside her. His massive hands held the leather reins lightly. The 12-pound iron hammer rested harmlessly at his boots once more. He didn't look like an avenging fury anymore. He looked like a man coming home. When they reached the stone forge, the late afternoon light was turning the river into a ribbon of molten glues. Old. Silas pulled the wagon into the yard, secured the brake, and stepped down. He offered his hand to Clara, and she took it, stepping carefully onto the dry earth. "I have a lot of work to do," Clara said, looking toward the river. "The ranch, the cabin, needs repairs before the winter sets in, and I need to hire hands to help with the herd if I'm going to hold the property." Silas didn't reply immediately. He unhitched the draft horse and led the massive animal toward the corral out back. Clara stood in the yard, a sudden, cold spike of uncertainty piercing her newfound relief. The battle was won, but the reality of her isolation remained. She was still a widow on a ruined ranch, and Silas McCray was a solitary blacksmith who had sworn off the world. He had fought for her because it was right, not because he wanted a permanent fixture in his quiet life. She walked slowly into the forge. The hearth was banked, the red coals glowing softly beneath the grey ash. The smell of iron, cedar smoke, and sweat was profoundly comforting to her now. It smelled like safety. She walked over to the anvil and ran her hand over the cold, pitted iron block. She had her land back, but for the first time, she realized she didn't want to go back to that empty, rotting cabin on the North Ridge. The thought of the silence there terrified her more than Vance's men ever had. Silas stepped back through the rear arch. Away. He had taken his hat off, and he walked over to the water basin to wash the dust from his face and arms. He dried his hands on a rough towel, his stormy grey eyes watching her from across the dim room. "You aren't going back to that cabin," Silas said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of pure geographical fact. Clara turned to face him, her heart doing a strange, fluttering rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. "Silas, it's my land. It's the only thing I have left to give this child." "Keep the land. Lease the grazing rights. Let the federal court sort out the timber," Silas said, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped a few feet from her, his massive frame towering in the shadows of the rafters. But you aren't living out there alone. The winter wind off that ridge will freeze a newborn in its crib before January. Then where am I supposed to go? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas looked down at her. He looked at her warm olive skin, the defiant set of her jaw, the hazel eyes that had stared down a corrupt town without blinking. He looked at the gentle swell of her belly beneath the faded plaid work shirt. Slowly, he reached out. His thick, soot-stained fingers gently brushed a stray lock of dark chestnut hair behind her ear. It was the most tender gesture she had ever seen a man make, made infinitely more powerful by the sheer, destructive capability of the hands that cough. Aired it. "The loft is too small," Silas murmured, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that settled right into the marrow of her bones. "And the stairs are too steep for a woman carrying a child. I'm going to tear out the east wall next week. I'll build a proper room. Ground floor, stone foundation, cedar walls to keep the heat." Clara stared at him, the breath catching painfully in her throat. "Silas, I spent 10 years trying to convince myself that iron and fire were enough company for a cursed man," Silas said, his eyes darkening with the weight of old ghosts finally being laid to rest. "I was wrong. A forge is just hot dirt if there's nothing worth building, Clara. You and that baby, you're worth building for." He didn't ask for her hand in marriage. He didn't offer a flowery declaration of romance. He offered her a cedar room, a warm fire, and a lifetime of standing between her and anything that dared to mean her harm. Clara looked into those stormy grey eyes and saw the absolute, unshakable truth of the man. She stepped forward, closing the final few inches between them, and rested her head against his broad, solid chest. She felt his massive arms wrap around her, pulling her close, enveloping her in a heat that was stronger and safer than any hearth fire. As she pressed her cheek against the rough cotton of his shirt, listening to the steady, powerful thumping of his heart, she felt her baby kick again. Silas felt it too. His large hand slid down, resting gently, almost reverently, over her stomach, claiming the child, claiming the woman, claiming the future he had once thrown away. Outside, the Montana sun dipped below the peaks, throwing the valley into cool, deep twilight. But inside the stone walls, the fire was stoked, the anvil was quiet, and the lone blacksmith who had fought the whole world with a hammer had finally found his home.